Welcome to the launch of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. I am James Gadi, an editor of afronomics.law.org, the conveners of this network, and a professor of law at Loyola University, Chicago. Before we proceed, kindly make sure that you're all muted and that so that we can be able to proceed with the program without a lot of disruptions. We don't expect this to last more than 75 minutes. After I give my introductory remarks, the 4 working groups of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network will take about 7 minutes each to outline the work of the network that we shall be engaging in for the next 1 year. So a few things about this network before I introduce the very hardworking members of this network that have been making conversations, listening, and learning to each other for several months before today. So this network, the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, is a coalition of citizens, scholars, civil society actors, church groups, and religious organizations committed to exposing the adverse impacts of unsustainable levels of Africa's sovereign debt on the lives of ordinary citizens. We all know, and there's a great post this morning, this evening, this moment on the blog on the situation of debt by Magali Masamba on the website, on the blog. The facts we all are aware. They need not be repeated, except just to say that in many African countries, the total debt, public debt service and external debt service payments have increased significantly. In many African countries, the ratio of external debt service payments relative to their exports have increased significantly, and the total debt service as a percentage of revenue has shot up significantly. In the last several years, many African governments spend an increasing percentage of their national budget on external debt payments. So in the last several years, many African governments spent an increasing percentage of their national budget on external debt payments. For example, in Kenya, this percentage increased sixfold to approximately 15% between the financial 2011 to 12 and the year 2019 to 2020. This percentage is more than the combined budgetary allocations that Kenya is spending on health, on agriculture, in the justice sector as well. With these realities, it's quite clear that the G20 debt service suspension initiative is insufficient to deal with the medium to long-term challenges of sovereign debt. As you will hear shortly from the 4 working groups of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, the network will not only seek to address impacts on sustainable debt and how procured spend. So as you hear shortly from the 4 working groups of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, the network will not only seek to expose the adverse impacts of unsustainable levels of African sovereign debt, but also how to increase accountability, responsibility of lenders and African governments about how sovereign debt is procured, spent, and repaid, to advocate for debt cancellation, rescheduling, restructuring, as well as increasing transparency. The mission of this network is to amplify African voices and to decolonize narratives on African sovereign debt. And everything that we shall be doing today in launching this network will illustrate what we mean by that. So the members of this Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, the first member is the Jesuit Ecology Network Africa, represented by Father Charles Chilufa, who is the director. The second is the Fellowship Christian Councils in Southern Africa, represented by Mandla Bongeni Hadebe. The third network member is the Fellowship Councils in the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa, represented by Jeanette Owi OSISA, the Executive Director, as well as Nicholas Amito, the Program Officer for Peace. The fourth member is NAWI, AfriFem Macroeconomics Collective, represented by its Director, Christos Simeoni, who is also here. The fifth member is Budget IT, a civic organization based in Nigeria and Sierra Leone focused on data transparency and increasing access to public finance information. The co-founder, Olesun, is one of who represents that group here. The sixth is the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar, represented by Dr. Sila Donga Samba. The seventh is Nweti in Mozambique, represented by its director, Denise Namborete. The eighth is ongolo.com, a blog that is committed to changing the narrative on Africa, represented by Molongo Muchelemba. The ninth is Rumbi Chisenga, an Obama Foundation Fellow. The 10th is Afrodad, one of the leading sovereign debt groups in Africa, represented by Jason Braganza and Dr. Theo as well. And we, the Afronomics Law Blog, are the conveners. So how did this debt network come to be? On 8th of May 2020, the Mozambique Constitutional Council decided that non-concessional loans totaling $662 million borrowed from two London-based banks were illegal, null and void. The Mozambican borrowers were three state-owned enterprises, and further to this decision by the Mozambican Constitutional Council, Afronomics Law convened a webinar titled Overturning Sovereign Debt for Violating National Law, Lessons from that Mozambican Constitutional Council decision. In early August 2020, a written symposium carried forward that conversation, and you can find the written symposium on the symposium category in our new blog that you can find at afronomicslaw.org. So from there, afronomics.org began a conversation with each of the members of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. And the network eventually came together in September 2020. And since then, we've been having meetings, listening and learning from each other as we design the agenda that we shall be letting everybody know about today. We are thankful to Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, OSISA, and AFRO for a grant that will be important for the work of this network. In a true sense, therefore, the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network is inspired by the mobilizational power of combining civil society activism as well as by the commitments of the religious and other organizations that are part of this coalition, as well as the research outputs that groups like ours, afronomics.law.org, put out. As the conveners of this network, afronomics.law.org recognizes that academics have to be involved in real life issues. At afronomicslaw.org, we try not to live in the ivory tower, but rather on the streets of justice, accountability, on the side of the less powerful, the subaltern, and this is what this network is about. We're in particular grateful to Mohammed Sultan, the Lapi Mamba, and Waikwa Wanyoike, all of the larger Open Society Foundation's organization, because of their support of this network and their guidance that made this organization possible. So we hope through this network to increase public and official awareness of the responsibilities of commercial creditors for sovereign debt lending and restructuring, to increase the efficiency of the African debt advocacy efforts, not because we are the first, but to complement existing efforts and to give them an even louder, amplified African voice, to highlight sovereign debt issues ahead of during the African Union Summit and the upcoming meeting of the African finance ministers in Addis Ababa, about which I'll say something about very, 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 very briefly, and which you'll hear about from each of the working groups. So we are not seeking as a network to displace other groups doing this work, but rather to complement their efforts. The context of the COVID-19 pandemic makes sovereign debt an even more significant imperative, as you'll be hearing from the four working groups. The four working groups of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network are the first, which you shall hear from, is the Working Group on Transparency and Accountability in Debt Management. The second is the Private Sector or Commercial Lenders Working Group. The third is the Working Group on the Impact of Sovereign Debt on Public Spending. And the fourth is a Working Group on Public Education, which is a cross-cutting theme across all those other working groups. 6 countries will be the primary focus of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. These are Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Senegal. Kenya will be the initial focus of the campaign. A major focal point, as I mentioned, of the campaign will be the 53rd session of the Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development that will be held from 17th to 23rd of March 2021. The Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network will do its best to get information about how the outcome decisions of that session will be arrived at, including all the actors involved. We are aware that there are lots of external actors who are involved, not just African actors in that meeting, who will be shaping the issues that meeting will arrive at conclusions about. And so we are very interested as a network in having more transparency and accountability and involvement of the private, of the civil society groups and citizens to know what's going on there. Finally, the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network has institutional partners. The partner that we want to announce that we have today is the Okoa Uchumi Coalition. That means it's a Swahili word, which means save the economy. It's a Kenyan platform committed towards working with all stakeholders to redress Kenya's debt crisis by pushing for political responsibility and accountability. Together with them, we are crafting an access to information request from the government of Kenya, and you'll be hearing more about that as the process evolves. We thank the Okoa Uchumi Coalition for their willingness to work with the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. We also have Magali Masamba, who has a blog post this morning on the blog as a senior fellow as associated with the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network. She just recently submitted a PhD thesis at the University of Pretoria on African sovereign debt. We also have a fellow, Sylvia Nona Tamale, a recent Masters of Law graduate from Harvard Law School, and most recently was a fellow at Oxfam's International Financial Institutions. She was a fellow at Oxfam's International Financial Institutions project based in Washington, D.C., where they monitored the IMF, the World Bank's response to the COVID-19 crisis and tracked their finances to several countries across several continents. So it's now time to hear from the working groups, and just to mention that those fellows will be helping to support the work of the network. So the first working group up is the working group on legal frameworks to ensure accountability for sovereign debt. I believe Molongo Muchalemba will be on for the next 7 minutes. So I'm passing the baton to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Good evening. My name is Malonga Muchalemba. I'm dialing in from Singapore, so it's evening for me. Good morning and good afternoon to the rest of you. So I'm representing the Transparency and Accountability and Debt Management Working Group. And I'd like to start off by saying we're not the first to undertake this work. We know that over the years, the World Bank, IMF, and several international organizations have been sounding the alarm about the unsustainable debt across Africa and the need for effective public debt management. There is growing concern about the recent sharp rise in government debt throughout Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the debt has ballooned to nearly 60% of GDP in the last decade and risen quite rapidly, on average between 10 and 25 percentage points annually since 2012. In less than one generation, the problem of unsustainable debt is back, not caused by the current COVID-19 economic shock, but undoubtedly exposed or worsened by it. So how do we interpret the fact that Africa's debt burden is back just a decade and a half after complete debt cancellation? We should acknowledge that external factors have contributed to this debt crisis, but we should also pay particular attention to the local conditions that have led to the previous and current crisis, such as the inadequate legal framework, weak debt management, as well as corruption. The lack of transparency and accountability by many governments and their institutions has negatively affected the relationship between state and citizens. African governments have lost the confidence of their citizens and need to win it back if any of the efforts in debt relief are to be legitimate and to make sense this time around. One major way to respond to the citizens' diminished confidence in their governments is to establish more binding rules, processes, and strong institutions that will ensure transparency, accountability, and good governance. Many African countries are carrying debt incurred by governments who borrowed without the people's consent and have used the funds without sufficient accountability and even used the funds to repress their people for personal gain. This is what is called the legal doctrine of odious debt, which is sovereign debt incurred without the consent of the people and not benefiting the people. Such debt should not, in principle, be transferred to a successive government, especially if the creditors are aware of the facts in advance. As James has mentioned, a good example is Mozambique. And as he said before, the Mozambican Constitutional Court ruled that debt that was incurred by two state-owned companies without the public knowledge could not be passed on to the government and therefore should be declared illegal. So what are the deliverables of our working group? So Transparency and Accountability in Debt Management Working Group has a mandate to research, propose, and re-emphasize the need for a legal framework for public debt management in Africa, with a view to enhancing transparency and accountability in public debt management. This framework will encompass the legal norms and institutions that already govern public sector debt and will reflect both the public and private law components. The focus on the need for accountability and transparency will be on both the lenders and the borrowers. In our view, the responsibility lies firmly on both sets of actors. Hence, any mechanism that seeks to address the core complex issues of transparency and accountability in debt management must go beyond simply focusing on the state borrower. And by the way, our work is not just about debt cancellation, because we know that African governments will still have a need to borrow even after debt cancellation. The point is that the acquisition of debt must be guided or supported by sound and binding public debt management instruments and processes. Context-driven public debt management instruments and processes will help African governments to raise the required debt financing with prudence and at the lowest possible cost over the medium to long term. The effective implementation of these debts for the relevant projects will also have to be adequately monitored. So why do we see the need for this? Well, the reality is across the continent, we're seeing evidence of a lack of adequate oversight, and can cite a good example from Kenya, which is one of our focus countries. If you can recall, back in October 2019, the Kenyan Parliament approved an increase of the debt ceiling to 100% of GDP. Parliament also approved the government's request to show the total debt not as a percentage of GDP, but as an absolute number. And this debt ceiling was approved by Parliament despite concerns raised by the Parliament Budgeting Office, whose job it is to advise parliamentarians on government spend. You know, the main concerns were fiscal discipline would go out of the window, and Kenya would also have to borrow externally as the domestic market was crowded out. And we know that also introduces an element of foreign exchange risk. They also recommended that the Auditor General carry out forensic audit of the debt stock. And yet this is the same Auditor General who reported that $2 billion of Eurobond proceeds in 2018 could not be accounted for by the Treasury, who also failed to provide a list of projects. So I only have less than 2 minutes left, so I'm going to quickly summarize what it is that our working group intends to do. First of all, we would like to identify the deficiencies in existing government processes, such as parliamentary oversight for government spend and debt, the Debt Management Office, and the role of the Auditor General. Secondly, we would like to propose binding rules and processes to drive greater discipline, transparency and accountability in government borrowing and expenditure. The third thing is we'd like to propose clear roles and responsibilities for key stakeholders such as the government, parliament, civil society, and also the general public in order to drive more democratic participation. And lastly, we recognize the need for training and workshops to help build capacity and key stakeholders. And I think one of the exciting things about having a webinar like this with people from all over the world is just to raise awareness and to share ideas. So I hope I've kept the time, James, but that's a quick wrap up of what our working group intends to do. So I'll pass the baton on to the next group.
Correct. Thank you very much, Mulongo. And the Commercial Private Lenders Working Group, and Jason Rosario Braganza is here to represent them. Thank you so much, Mulongo.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining the launch of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. My name is Jason Braganza. I will apologize in advance in case you hear some huge crash bang wallop sounds. It's an unintended soundtrack to my presentation. We have the builders in today, so excuses for that. Together with James and Siala, we are part of the private creditors working group working under the network, one of the 4 working groups that have come together to sort of look at the debt landscape within the continent, and appreciating how the debt landscape has evolved over the past 15 to 20 years as several of our countries have developed, have grown, have actually managed to access different types of financial markets and debt instruments as a way of financing their national development agendas. In addition to that, there has been a proliferation of players in the market beyond just your traditional bilateral lenders. Many of these have come from the private sector offering all different types of financial debt instruments with different types of maturity rates, with different types of returns on those investment instruments, and in particular as well the idea of the offering of substantially lower interest rates than actually borrowing on the continent. And this, of course, combined with the need to finance their development agenda. Many African governments have been allured to taking up this foreign debt onto their books without necessarily properly negotiating them, or, as Mulongo has said, having the kind of a proper sovereign infrastructure in place when trying to negotiate these debts and protect their balance sheets in the cases of difficulty. And why we're focusing particularly on the private creditors is because over the past 10, 15 years, this number, their proportion or holding of sovereign debt has increased gradually. The latest statistics, I think, from the World Bank's debt statistics, I think, says, globally, they're holding nearly 19% of global sovereign debt. And this is quite a significant figure when you look at the amounts that we're talking about when it comes specifically to sub-Saharan Africa. So for us, this is a very important segment of the debt portfolio, the debt pie, if you'd like, that we really need to focus on. The second reason to do with that is how the private creditors are engaging with our national governments and the extent to which the public or citizens are also involved in those conversations. Similar with other types of agreements, debt agreements are no stranger to arm twisting, backhand deals, and so on and so forth. And if you do not have a close eye on how these debt arrangements are being negotiated and agreed, then there is a high risk or high chance that a sovereign state might find itself in a bit of difficulty should they be at times of challenges like we're facing right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is important to understand how these private creditors participate in generating finance for our governments and the role with which they need to uphold themselves accountable So that's sort of a second part of what we're trying to do under this working group. The third bit is sort of trying to discourage as much as possible the leaning towards over-dependence on private finance, particularly at the multilateral level on the continent. So multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank, UNECA, the African Union, and so on. We're really trying to encourage them not to over-rely on this private arm or private line of credits that they espouse and the advice that they give to our member states. And the way we plan to do that is through investigations, through research, and to try and actually bring up the risks that are inherent in this space if the framework that's not in place properly, as Mulongo has mentioned, on the transparency side, which equally is needed on how negotiations with the private creditors are done. So the legal framework with that is equally important. And so working with our multilateral institutions to get the member state buy-in and have a continental framework of how to engage this in these negotiations and in these discussions is very important. One may liken it to how double tax treaties are being approached at the moment, or the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, or even the digital taxation conversations. There is a huge drive to have a Pan-African and continental position on some of this. So this is no different when it comes to the conversation around debt and specifically how we handle private creditors. The fifth part of this is getting the private creditors onto the negotiating table when it comes to issues of debt relief, debt restructuring, and eventual debt cancellation. Hitherto, because there are such new entrants in the market or in the space, they've been, heavily reluctant to be part of the more global conversations on how debt instruments and how debt negotiations and restructuring takes place. And also the global mechanisms that are in place there haven't taken into account what role or to have the private sector or the private creditors on the table. So part of this working group's task will be to find ways of encouraging private creditors to come onto the table and discuss through a multilateral global system and mechanism. And the final bit, of course, is to look at how the contracts are designed, looking at specific clauses, the extent to which they either uphold or undermine domestic legislation. And I know, we've got colleagues who will be talking about that in more detail, but in certain negotiation contracts that involve private creditors, and some of us might be familiar with with the statement that was made in Kenya, one of our focus countries, towards the end of last year, with the cabinet secretary, stating very explicitly that because of the Eurobond that had been issued by the government, they weren't able to seek debt relief or debt restructuring of their debt because it may have been amounting to some sort of default, and that there was a clause that sort of prevented them from doing that. So those sorts of things and those sorts of clauses within the context of how private creditors engage with our developing countries and our African governments are very important, and it's something that we're sort of focusing on. And James did touch on also the spaces that we want to engage in on the continent. It's the African Union, it's the African Development Bank, the UNECA, and at the global level, certainly with the IMF and the United Nations Financing for Development track, and of course the UNCTAD process as well. So these are the reasons why we think as a network, engaging with the private creditor issues and analysis is equally important, but also because they are not going to go away as a route or as an avenue for finance, especially given many of our African countries are graduating away from low income to low middle income, and this means that the concessional type financing also becomes a bit more constrained, which then forces our governments to sort of go out and look for alternative forms of finance, and the private creditors are always too willing and waiting to sort of quote unquote help out, but we need to be on our toes and just make sure that we hold them account. So I'll stop there because I think I've just about reached 7 minutes and hand over back to James. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, and we are delighted that like all the other members many of the other members that you're actually based right there in the continent and still doing a lot of important work. So next is the cross-cutting theme of public education, and Dr. Titilayo Delabola will be telling us something about that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and thanks to the other members of the working groups that have presented their own contributions and interventions. So the public education on cross-cutting themes will cover and raise public education awareness about the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. We are comprised of myself, Rumbi Chisenga, and Nicola Frekala. And we're also working closely with the Impact of Debt on Public Spending Group, working group. The aim of the public education ambit of the network is to raise awareness about sovereign debt in Africa. Three central themes that will be discussed are the historical trajectories of sovereign debt, the changing compositions of creditors, and the current state of sovereign debt. The overarching aim of the public education group is to foster accountability on sovereign debt in Africa, and in doing so to facilitate its management, restructuring, and cancellations as appropriate. Countries' experiences and existing studies show that information transparency, robust debt databases, and stakeholders' actions, including civil society organizations, can contribute to sovereign debt restructuring or cancellation and promote the health of economies. We aim to uncover through nuanced documentation the hidden features of debt. While our initial focus is 6 countries, Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Senegal, we will start our interventions with Kenya. We already have a comprehensive uncensored documentary on the standard gauge railway debt and other similar documents on the trajectory of debt in Kenya from 2011 to 2020. Some of the information we have include the total debt service payments, total external debt service payments, the percentage of national budget spent on external debt repayments, the GDP to debt ratio, the GDP to external debt ratio, the total debt service as a percentage of revenue, and total external debt service as a percentage of exports. The network has already translated, and our fellows have already translated some of the information into easily accessible charts that will be uploaded on the website shortly. And some of our plans moving forward with the public education ambit is to coordinate the crafting and circulation of communication documents on sovereign debt. We will prepare the background briefs on sovereign debts in Africa, communication documents following the forthcoming African Finance Ministers meetings in February 2021, and the 53rd session of the Economic Commission for Africa's meeting. We're also going to prepare some policy briefs and recommendations for our 6 focus countries, and all of our documents will be tailored to suit the different constituencies that we're working on. In line with our public education and advocacy campaign, we're also going to organize other events, so webinars that focus on each of our country states, our written symposiums, and we're going to engage with media platform in the 6 countries alongside our interventions on Afronomics law. So I'll turn over to the Impact of Debt on Public Spending group to share their further interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. I see that that working group on public spending always back. All right.
All right. Thank you so much. It's a whole pleasure being here today. Yeah. So I would take on the impact on public of debt on public spending group. Our mandate is to contextualize and highlight the impact of debt on public spending in case study countries. So we have chosen some few countries, which includes Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Senegal. And we have tried to make sure that we have a spread across Africa. And we also try to group these countries based on the ones that have a severe debt impact, some like Zimbabwe and Zambia. Mozambique, and also those ones have emerging challenges like Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. To achieve this, one of the things we want to do is to compare and contrast the state of play in most of these case study countries to ascertain the deterioration caused by debt crisis, especially gains lost due to debt crisis in terms of human development. So we're looking at the impact of debt on shortening revenues to expand human development in our focus countries. We're also trying to highlight the value for money lost in terms of African countries' engagement with funding donors, especially when it comes to opacity around debt being provided to African countries by creditors across the world. We also want to highlight the losses in terms of social spending in our case study due to debt crisis. So we want to look at what could have been the alternative scenarios in funding education and the health and some other critical sectors that are important to development of a country. So just because the country, most of these countries have invested heavily in debt over the years. Finally, we would highlight alternate scenarios where our case studies, where we looked at unsustainable debt and we look at the contextual gravity in some of these countries. So we look at also the challenges, the gravity of debt within this focus country. And the end is to look at what exactly is the impact of debt on public spending. For example, in Nigeria, where I'm from, the component of our public expenditure that has been severely growing in the recent years has been the public expenditure, debt expenditure management. So it's also to take a look at that across Africa. In the end, our goal in the short term is to provide a working paper that raises awareness on the impact of debt on public spending in case study countries. That's our first goal. The second is also to look at different experiences of non-state actors, non-government actors pressing for transparency and accountability in terms of obtaining foreign loans in focus countries. So we also want to look at efforts around debt transparency by non-state actors and government actors across the focus countries. And we also want to develop a comprehensive database of debt profiles for our case studies. We'll do this in partnership with the public education group to ensure that we can build a robust engagement. So that's it from the impact of debt on public spending. Thank you.
These groups are so efficient. They are understating everything that they have done. We've been having meetings for months and months, and they're not even using their 7 minutes. Am I correct, Olu, that that's about it? Or Dr. Ohio, you want to add?
Yeah, no, that's about it. Well, you know, there's a significant nexus in what our working group is doing in connection with the public education group. So yeah, always captured the key points.
Excellent. So this is a good time to get invite suggestions, invite questions, to get ideas from the audience about the plans that we have outlined. I see Maxwell Miyawa is on the line. He always has a question. Maxwell, how are you? Not currently available. I see Wanjiro Gikonyo is one of the members of the Okwa Uchumi Coalition in Kenya is on the line as well. And, you know, one of our institutional partners. We are going to be doing a access to information request to the Kenyan government. Maxwell, you're back? I think you've been muted. Let's see whether we can unmute you. Do
you want to try now?
Yeah. And Wanjiro wants to unmute BC if you can help.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be part of the this inaugural event. I just came in Kenya at 5 o'clock right now. I came quite a little bit late, and I'm sure I must have missed the very first presenters presentations. So I don't have so much question, except that I heard one of the presenters mention the question of enhancing accountability in relation to sovereign debt management as part of the study that the working group is going to be doing. I would have wished to hear more, particularly how the education program is going to enhance this new initiative for accountability. The question of accountability in sovereign debt management is very, very crucial in my view, especially for these middle-income countries, Kenya being one of them, or the emerging middle-income countries. And there is a spending or a debt borrowing spree in our country, which I think the IMF has sounded some alarms. So I would have wished to see that, to get an inkling or some view of what are some of the considerations or some of the issues that they may be looking at when considering these questions of accountability, particularly as it relates to how sovereign debt affects development. Interventions by these international institutions and even the management of development generally within our national economies. That's that.
Okay, I think the public education bit, Dr. Adebola, or anyone in that group, do you want to chime in?
Okay, thanks, James. I think I can start, then Ohio and Olu can jump in. So one of the things that we realized with debt in Africa is that it's usually hidden. So the information is not easily accessible. So one of the things that we're going to do with our public education working group would be to generate data and information. And with our data and information, we'll be equipped to engage in the conversations that we want to on accountability. So we're going to be engaging with the different stakeholders, so the creditors, the government institutions, and we think with our data, we'll be empowered to make the types of demands that we want with respect to accountability. We saw that with the example from Mozambique, and that is one of the things that we would like to translate with the other 6 case studies that we're working on. So we realized that many times the information about sovereign debt is not publicly available. So we have situations where the countries, the citizens do not even know about the sovereign debts that are being generated on their behalf. So that would be one of the main prongs of our efforts, would be to generate the data comprehensively and robustly in a way that can stand what the actual practice and the reality on the ground is. And we think that that would then enhance the types of accountability that we want across board. So not just at the national level, but even at the international level with the types of transactions that are being undertaken. So Ohio and Olu can jump in. Thank you for the question as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Maxwell, for that question. And thank you, Titi, for your intervention. And what I would say in addition, I mean, in a recent meeting we had, it was something that came up in terms of the information being publicly available is one thing, but being able to understand, to break down, to, sometimes we need jargon busters to be able to come to terms with the details that you would find in this type of statement. I mean, if the man on the street should go through say maybe a debt register, maybe in say Kenya, for instance, would they be able to interpret or understand the significance, or should I say the real impact of these transactions and activities? And I would answer is no. So in that context, I believe it will be a challenge, but it's a challenge we are really excited about in terms of how do we transmit this information in a way that is easily accessible to the common man. And when we mean the common man, I mean, we're looking at being able to reach different levels of literacy, levels of understanding of both financial details, and just essentially being able to make that connection between what you borrow and what's done with it and the processes in between that helps to facilitate these activities. So in that context, one way in which we can push this forward is use of, things as may look simple as infographics to break it down, and then also the use of case studies, which Olu mentioned, and his organization, Budget IT, has been very fantastic at that. Being able to translate things in a way that someone looks at it and goes, oh, wow, is this what it really means? In the sense of, this is what is gained, this is what is lost. And this is what happens if we are not socially conscious and active in putting or holding our politicians and these different stakeholders to account. And also, in the context of being able to have public awareness activities like this, prior to the webinar we had on the Mozambique case, most information about it might have been very familiar to people within certain circles if you were looking for it. But one of the interesting things we've learned with the use of things like webinar, it's a way of being able to pass across information. Or, having interviews with Malongo, for instance, you're able to ask very difficult questions that you might not find on the mainstream media, or that might not be put to you in a way that you will understand its real deleterious effect on the economies and the societies and the common man. So that would be our challenge of trying to decipher and bust those jargons, demystify the technical terms, bring it down to a language that people can easily understand.
Thanks, Ohio. Wanjiro, did you want to come in now?
Yes, I will. And I apologize. I have a problem with my camera, and but I can join by audio. It's a pleasure to be here and to witness this really very significant event as the network launches with the objectives that have been outlined. On behalf of the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, which, as you heard, is a Kenyan-based civil society informal network, we are very happy to be associated with this event and with this platform. And we look forward to drawing on the expertise that the network brings and to working together in Kenya and also regionally. And I associate very strongly with the submissions of the 4 working groups. And it's very encouraging to hear the things you said, spanning from looking at legislative frameworks, looking at capacity building, of course, looking at the civic mobilization, citizen education. And we look forward to working around those as well. And just my 2 reflections, and they are more of reflections, not necessarily trying to elicit a response, is that we are very keen to get involved in the advocacy around debt transparency and in the advocacy around the legislative frameworks, but also around the philosophical discussion around development, and particularly looking at debt procurement, large infrastructure vis-a-vis what we view as sustainable bottom-up participatory development models, because we have seen that large infrastructure has large procurement opportunities and often comes at the expense of effective local governance and community level development. So, looking really at decentralization vis-a-vis large infrastructure kind of development. So that is one area we'd be very keen to see discussed, because we think part of the problem, and I think this is acknowledged here as well, part of the problem with debt is also informed by this erroneous infrastructure-led development thinking. I think the second issue that we are grappling with is civic mobilization in a context of high impunity. How do we manage to engage citizens, work with what kind of information is actionable? How do we conscientize citizens? How do we support their engagement when you have abject impunity by the political class? So we look forward to engaging around these questions and drawing on expertise and capacities and exchanging lessons as we proceed. So congratulations once again to the entire team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wanjiru. Crystal.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Crystal Simeone from Naui, and I'm really, really honored to be part of the network. And just to add from what Wanjiru talked about and to respond to the question that Maxwell had posed on accountability, I think it's important to center African citizens, and whether that is accountability from an African political class or from an accountability from a global economic system that is set up, to work against a lot of policies and against the very lives of African citizens. So I think it's important to question a lot of why we're taking the debt. And as Wanjiru spoke, there's been an influx of projects centered around mega infrastructure and taking loans and public-private partnerships around mega infrastructure, with questions around how it really benefits actual lives of citizens is a question that I think will come up as we work with the network and with a lot of you on this call. Wanjiru also spoke about impunity, and I think being Kenyan, we all know that we do have a level of transparency on the newspapers every day. How many billions have been borrowed? How many trillions have been stolen? We know our president the last week said, 2 billion shillings is stolen every day. Where that goes, we don't know, but it's very openly said. And so the transparency to some extent exists. The question around impunity, the question around accountability, I think is the next step of really questioning the system. And that questioning works towards questioning the political class at a national and subnational level, but also very importantly of a global economic system that systemically and continuously works against the people of this continent.
Thanks a lot. Batura Michael, do you want to comment?
Sure, thank you very much, Len. Yes, my name is Butera Michael. I'm a student, and my question slightly on a student's level, and it's I raise a voice as a student. And I was trying to understand when Tito was presenting on the public education, public data education. I was thinking about on what level are going students to be involved, education sector, in terms of institutions. I mean, these are the students that evolve to be policymakers later, and then they would have pick up, that public awareness and that advocacy, like the knowledge that comes with that we've been lacking. When I'm currently taking international economic law and other units, but we really understand even, the basic mechanism of lending by IMF. So how do you intend to involve a students level, or just the way Afronomics academic firm is involved? I would want to hear where you place, this education, the students who form part of the great mass of the continent. Thank you very much.
Can I just, this co-moderator prerogative to say that 3 questions that have raised this question of engagement of the students and the youth, and the comment made by Wanjiru as well with regard to citizen mobilization, where there's a lot of impunity. And one of our network members who really is one of the inspirations for this network is Denise Namburete. And I know she's on the call. I wonder if she's able to say something, because if we are to really get any guidance or inspiration, it's what happened in Mozambique. The courts in Mozambique overturned sovereign debt contracts, and I don't want to say more if she can. Let's see if she's in a position to say something, because I think those that listened to her when we had our webinar in August would agree that the experience in Mozambique is really instructional for all those questions. So Denise, are you able to chime in? Is she unmuted?
I'll just confirm that.
Okay.
A second. Thanks.
So as we wait to see if Denise can say a word about that, we do have the materials of the written symposium that followed that webinar on the blog. So I'd refer you to that if Denise is unable to chime in at the moment. But if there is an example that is really important in terms of answering those questions, it's the experience in Mozambique that as I said at the beginning, is really instructional for how this network came into being. Because if they could do it in Mozambique, I think it could happen in many other African countries. And not only did they do it in Mozambique, they were able to mobilize support with prosecutions here in North America, with cases in Europe, pursuing all the actors involved, not just the domestic actors, but all the international actors as well. So I guess, BC, we can go to the next question and wait to see if Molongo has something to say before we move on. Yeah.
Oh, just to be sure, Denise, I've asked you to unmute a couple of times. So if you want to just do that right now, that would be great. Oh, well, we can move on for now. Yeah, we can move on for now. Thanks.
Molongo? Oh, BC Molongo wants to come in.
Sure.
Sorry to make it more complicated than it is, but we have to now.
It's necessary. I totally understand. I thought that was a really valid question. I wanted to just share personal experience when it comes to education and why I think the education work stream is really important and a key cornerstone to what we're trying to do. And I think one of the challenges we have in many tertiary education systems in Africa is we don't teach people to critically think. So I did my first degree in Zambia, and my main takeaway was to study as much as possible in a short space of time, take instructions, write exams, and pass. We teach people to just get through school and basic skills around timekeeping, well, not really timekeeping, but how to manage your time, how to do assignments, but we don't really empower high school and tertiary education students to really critically think and have a point of view, especially point of view. And then I went from University of Zambia to Oxford, where your exam question is, should the UK join the Euro? And I had to have a point of view. And it really, and the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. So I never thought there was anything wrong with the way we do university. I actually learned a lot of personal and soft skills from university in Zambia that I use in work today than I did from Oxford. But in terms of having a point of view and critical thinking, that is something that is deeply missing. So in terms of education, it's about empowering people to actually be able to question and to have a point of view. And culturally, we're not taught that way. We are taught to look at the government the way we look at our chiefs and not question what it is that they're doing. But we need to figure out how to empower people to actually have a point of view and to question what people are telling us. And once we change that mindset, and it starts with the university because they're ripe with with the ability to change. And so students like, I think it was Michael who spoke, will be really key in actually being ambassadors to change this thinking that you can't just take what the government says at face value, but you should be able to say why. Why are you borrowing? What is it for? Will you make the money back? That's something that's always missing in sovereign debt. So in Zambia, where I'm from, government spends $5 billion $1 billion every year on roads. These are roads that have zero economic value most of the time. No one is asking those questions. Parliamentarians are not asking those questions. Civil society is not answering those questions. And more importantly, students who have a voice and a very powerful force of change are not asking those questions. So education is really key, and it's great to see young people who are already engaged, and we'll see how we can use you to actually spread the message. That's it. Thanks, Missy.
Thanks, Mlongo. Ohio, I know you have 2 fingers, but we'll let Denise go, and then we can come back to you. Okay, thanks. Yes, Denise.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to share a bit of the experience from Mozambique. And I'll speak to the some of the advocacy strategies that we used, and maybe, you know, to contribute to this conversation, not only about public education and awareness, but also about advocacy, some of the advocacy strategies that led to the debt cancellation, at least in the context of Mozambique. I think our vision was actually to contribute to restoring Mozambique public debt sustainability, and by increasing the cost of the illegal debt on responsible parties and their key stakeholders, including those holding responsible parties accountable. And we are speaking about the regulators, the borrowers, the private sector, the banks that were involved, and we hope that all would contribute to a sustainable development of the issues. So the strategy included awareness building about sovereign debt crisis. We use a very dynamic communication strategy to systematically disseminate information on the crisis locally and globally. It was very intense in that sense. We also had a pillar on advocacy for debt cancellation in Mozambique and all the relevant jurisdictions. In many of the debts we are talking about, it involves several countries. In the case of Mozambique, it involved 7 countries. So we needed to go to all these countries and engage directly with those that were responsible for this illegal debt. And we had to use a lot of research findings and partners to approach, use international organizations, international partners as a bridge to approach decision makers and regulators across 7 countries. We also did a lot of litigation against responsible parties. I guess we started 4 different court cases in South Africa, 1 in Mozambique, and then that led to court cases that we eventually saw the Mozambican government in London against the borrowers. So we did pursue various legal means to nullify the loans, holding responsible partners to account, and actually involved in demanding repatriation of funds. And then I think the last issue I'll speak to is about campaign for better global policy and standards in terms of sustaining global advocacy for improving the standards and policies to prevent future illegal debts or irresponsible debts, especially in low-income countries. So I would say that public campaign has the possibility of distributing the social cost of illegal debt. You might have seen then Credit Suisse moving out of the African continent. They had such a devastating impact in their revenue. So we did engage with them to let them know that we are going to make such a noise that you are going to suffer some level of impact. And maybe at that point you have some, you look at this kind of negotiations differently. So the primary target groups of the strategy were decision makers, as I said, but we also approach investigative agencies, judicial and legislative arms of governments in the UK, in Switzerland, in Netherlands, and Norway. So I think this has taught us that we have to engage with those who have the potential, who have the power to undo these irresponsible, some of the responsible debts that we have made. So it is, I would say it's very important that we have our focus in the few countries that we have selected for our work. And at the same time, we have this bigger umbrella that we know that at some point we'll have to engage with these global financial institutions and with the borrowers to include them in the negotiations, in the discussions, especially because these very same countries that fund our budgets, that fund aid in developing countries, these are the very same countries borrowing, some of them irresponsible, some of them illegally to African countries. So this is a complicated situation, I think, for us to negotiate, but we need to start to engage with, our basically our aid and development partners in regard to the illegal debts and irresponsibles in our countries. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Dennis. You had your hand up. Do you want to? Yep.
Yeah, I just want thank you, Denise, and thank you, Malongo, for sharing your experience. I want to speak to the question from Michael because it's a very valid one, and Michael is part of the academic forum that economics law set up. And one of the reasons why we initiated that platform was to be able to present an informal space to be able to ask critical questions and get critical perspectives about things that we may not get within the four walls of our existing, the way our university is structured. And, Michael could bear witness to that, I mean, most of the conversations and lectures we've had on different or various topics of international economic law, the global, relating to the global economy, have been critical and reflective, giving them an opportunity to think about these things from a very, from a different perspective. And so it's interesting to see that this has come up as a recurring question here. So I just want to say that, I mean, if you are you're a student, you're a youth, and because we want to also foster intergenerational conversations and make sure that we have people from different time. Because I mean, one of the things we need to understand about the impact of debt is just the same way we talk about climate change and making sure that we're preserving the continent or the earth for a future generation. These things have an impact on future generations. So the future generation needs to be involved in the conversation now, because at some point in time, if we can't keep speaking if we don't have people who are following behind, who are also getting an understanding of what this means. So I'm sure this will give us a lot of ideas on how we can engage with a broader network as the student community, both within the continent and outside also too.
Thanks, Ohio. Thank you very much. So in the intervening period between the back and forth, very interesting ones, we've had a couple of questions in the chat box, which would like to ask. One that has, if I can call on James to just speak quickly to this. This is the first one that has come up from the back end. Is congratulations on the launch. I have a question. What is the plan to have the network's communication in different languages of the country covered?
That's a good question, and I'll take that with the question about the choice of the countries. There was a question about the choice of the countries, and just to say fast about the choice of the countries, we have Kenya, which is going to be the country of focus to begin with. Then we'll have Zambia, then we'll have Zimbabwe, we'll have Mozambique, we'll have Nigeria, and then Senegal. As Denise said, it was really difficult to come up with that list. That was a list negotiated over a long period of time. Initially, when we began ideas about this network, we wanted to do the whole of Africa. And somebody said, precisely because of the challenges like the language barrier, we are speaking English, that we couldn't be able to do this for the entire continent. Fortunately, within our network, we have different language capabilities, from, Portuguese to French. And in fact, I think Sila can say something about that. Sila Dongo, who is based in Senegal. And therefore, the choice of the countries was just based on the fact that this network cannot realistically, in the initial 1-year period we are doing this work, cover the entire continent. Geographically, Africa is the largest continent, if you didn't know. It's highly heterogeneous, highly diverse, an amazing continent. It's really impossible to say that you could have a network like this do the work in the entire continent. The second thing about the languages, this has been one of the discussions we've been having, especially with the public education group. And that is why we are so delighted to have not only such a broad network, but also institutional partners like the Okoa Uchumi, which is already in Swahili. So we are not claiming, like Mulonga and everybody said, sole expertise on the issues. We want to collaborate, like I've invited and others have invited Michael. If the students have energy to do this, we are happy to collaborate with you. We are doing this in addition to all the other things we do, not only on the blog and in our personal lives, working from home. And so, we are doing this because we are really committed to this vision. And we are delighted to see so many people on the call who are willing to help us to realize these visions that we've been chatting about for several months before we thought we were ready to go public. So this is really an invitation to all of you, like the senior fellow and the fellow. They've sort of been doing all this work to support the production of this knowledge. But we also do realize, like Michael and everybody is asking, that we have to see how best we can to sort of reach as many people, especially the youth, as possible. And that's the challenge that we hope you can help us with.
Thank you very much, James. I wouldn't add if it is a very good challenge, but one that we are willing to take up. We have a question from Mary Lou, who asked, what role would the network play in drawing attention to governments overstepping their bounds in trying to manage their public debt? She says recently there have been plans by certain governments, she didn't say, with highly unsustainable debt level to use the pension funds of civil servants and unclaimed dividends to service their public debt. I'm not sure if that maps onto Nigeria, but I'm wondering if anyone in the network group wants to come in. I'd like not to put anyone on the spot. Do we have any? Okay, so while folks are thinking, I could maybe speak to the first half. You said, what role would the network play in drawing attention to government overstepping their bounds in trying to manage their public debt? As I think Dr. Adebola mentioned in her brief remarks, one of the core aspects of this is to really galvanize various interest groups. And as Denise has shown in the context of Mozambique, really bringing pressure to bear on the governments that of the countries we have chosen will require a lot of efforts, not just from us, not just from non-governmental organizations broadly, but religious groups. And so Charles Chilufa, whose video is on, is one of the persons in the religious bucket that is also involved in this. And so in as much as we believe that legal frameworks in the group I belong to with Mulongo will be critical to the work we do, we see these beyond that. And as Ohio and Titia said, really translating the impact of this debt on the socioeconomic and human rights of daily living is critical so that people know how these debts from wherever they come from really impact their daily living. And perhaps in many cases, quite unfortunately, short circuits their future in terms of economic development. So we will, in a nutshell, bring pressure to bear, hopefully, in various means, some of which have been discussed here. Okay, the second part is, she says, recently there have been plans by certain government with highly unsustainable debt level to use pension funds of civil servants and unclaimed. Okay, so I think that is just illustrative of what you're trying to do, to say how can we stop this. It takes a lot, and hopefully in the little one we are planning to do, we can move that aspect forward. Okay, let's see. So we have Ndongo. Okay, one of our network members. I'll bring him in now. Just a second. Yes, Ndongo, you can come in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was really a great pleasure to be here for the launching of this network. I would like just to make a comment about the debt ceilings, because we know that often we have a macroeconomic framework where it is said that our government, if they want to manage properly the public resources, they should not be allowed to have, let's say, some level of debt compared to their GDP. For example, in West Africa, most countries are trying to have a debt GDP ratio below 70%. I would say that when we use proper economic theory, there is no such thing as a bound in terms of debt GDP ratio. What is important first is that this debt is well managed. That means that the public debt is used. The second thing is the cost of the debt. For example, if the debt service is manageable for public finance. And most importantly, there is this difference between debt in foreign currency and debt in domestic currency. It's really different because debt in domestic currency does not involve many issues, because when you issue your own currency, you could not be technically insolvent in your own currency. But when you are indebted in foreign currency, that means you have to obtain the foreign currency. And one way to obtain the foreign currency is to have net importing. So it's really different to have debt in domestic currency and debt in foreign currency. I think in this current framework, we have also to demystify many narratives about the debt. We have to make sure that the narrative that the states, African states, have to be limited in terms of their spending power. We have also to deconstruct that narrative, because when you are indebted in your own currency, the debt has as a counterpart, let's say, more financial wealth for your private sector. So we have to see it like this. The debt of the states in its own currency is exactly the net wealth of the private sector. While when you are indebted in foreign currency, you make the promise that you have net exports so that you could service your debt. So it's really two different things. And I think in this network, we are dealing much more with debt in foreign currency. So provided that we are okay that the debt, public debt, has to be expended for public purpose, there is no sense at all at limiting, let's say, the debt to GDP ratio. The best example of that is Japan. You take Japan, the debt GDP ratio is more than 200%. And yet there is no panic at all. And the interest rates on the public sovereign debt is nearly 0%. That means that when you have your own currency and your government is cooperating with your central bank, the cost of debt in domestic currency is controlled by the central bank. While debt on the foreign currency, it depends on how the markets evaluate the risk of sovereign borrowers. So those are two different things, but we have to deconstruct the narrative that there exists something like a bond, let's say a limit in terms of public borrowing. In case of foreign currency, it's really dangerous to be indebted in foreign currency. But when it comes to domestic currency, the debt of the states has as its counterpart the net financial wealth of the private sector. So debt in itself is not a bad thing. When the states say that they won't have a public deficit, that means that they say they will not contribute to the financial wealth of the private sector. So this also has to be made clear. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ndongo. I was just wondering if Father Chilufa wants to say, chime in the conversation before I pass the baton to James.
Thanks, PC. It's exciting to be here and to listen to everything that the conversation, and we look forward to some great work that we're going to do together. Just 2 points. I think what I wanted to say, you covered it very well, was just to mention that here we are a network of different people with different connections. So there was some questions in regard to how we're going to engage and how many countries and things like that, so that this network doesn't have to engage everywhere and be everywhere, but it has very many connections among all of us here. So the strategic step that we could take is just to see how we network the resources that we have here or outside. I think you covered that very, very well. And I mentioned to James, our network is quite large. It covers 46 sub-Saharan African countries with connections to Europe. And this network will play a very good role of all these people, high-powered people, to produce products that other networks could mobilize and use for greater impact, because other networks may be big, but they may not have the resources that this group has. And this network can offer those resources, and in that way we can create large impact. Just a very quick one on, I think, what's his name? The Aphrodite man.
Jason.
Jason, I'd like to reiterate that was the problem we have is like Mulongo asked, how come the debt problem is back in such a short time? And so what we are doing is not just to heal the wound from the surface. I think that's important to keep in mind. And Jason has been emphasizing that whatever we do, whatever group we work on, we must work at, healing the problem from the root. That means the problem is just the way the global economy is arranged. And whatever we do, we must also pay attention to that. We know we have our own problems in Africa, but we also know that the way the rules are made affect the way we educate. Somebody spoke about education. The rules that are made globally affect the way we do everything. So that also needs to underlie everything we do, whether we're talking about education or talking about legal systems, whatever we do, must also pay attention to the global systems.
Thank you very much, Charles. Indeed, we can't do what we're doing without paying important attention to that. James, over to you.
Well, thank you. So we'll be ending in a minute or two. I just want to, answer one of the other questions Patrick Anama asked about engagement with individual key actors. He mentioned China, and then addressing secrecy in recipient countries. And one of the things I'd like to say about the second question about secrecy is that, like I said at the beginning, we are working, as an example, we are working with Okoa Uchumi, the Okoa Uchumi Coalition in Kenya, to make a request for some information. And that request that we are making, that's permissible under the Kenyan Constitution, is something we've been debating and discussing with them for a couple of weeks. We can ask for a lot of information, and we have gotten very good practical guidance, including yesterday morning. We had a meeting with Wanjiru Gikonyo and the Okoa Uchumi Coalition. we have to think about who we are going to address it. Is it to Parliament? Is it to one of the other commissions identified in the Constitution? Would it be to file a lawsuit? We are debating all those options. And the experience that we are likely to chart in Kenya is likely to be replicated in the other countries, or we might pursue different strategies in the different countries. The bottom line is that we'll be calling on all of you. That is why we were having this lounge. This is like an invitation to all of you to help us, as Father Chilufa was saying, that this is a network that belongs to all of you and to all of us. With regard to engagement of individual key actors, I just want to reiterate what many of the working groups emphasize, and in particular Jason, who talked about making sure that we are paying attention to the commercial creditors, to the underwriters, to a lot of the other groups that are really invisible. Just to emphasize, Father Chilufa said, we have to also to see the whole range of actors involved in African sovereign debt. The governments are important, but so are all the other commercial entities that are advising, the transaction advisors that are advising these governments. So we've had this discussion, for example, with the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, looking at the Public Finance Management Act that gives the Treasury, the Kenyan Treasury, power to employ underwriters. I don't think Kenyans have ever known who the underwriters for Kenyan sovereign debt are. Patrick, we're going to be calling on you. You are a lawyer in Kenya. You might have a lot of advice. You might have a lot of connections. So we'll be calling on you. Would have loved to have this event in person, of course. Unfortunately, the pandemic makes it possible to see more people, but impossible for us to meet in person. Thanks for your patience. I've never experienced a Zoom bomb before. Thank you so much for being patient with us through that. This launch shows that our work is cut out for us. So over the next 1 year, we are counting on your support. What you can count on from us is that we are very committed to moving this project forward along all those 4 working groups and to sort of embrace more energy from as many people as possible. So when we reach out and tell you what our next plans are, especially with regard to the upcoming meeting of the African Ministers of Finance, Development and Planning in Addis, please help us to make sure that we can hold, even if virtually, a parallel meeting to that meeting. There are many other meetings coming up, including Davos and so on and so forth. We hope that we'll use those opportunities to increase the awareness and the attention to these issues from the perspectives that are most underrepresented, but which are really critical. So asante sana, as we say in Swahili in Kenya, and thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you. This is just the beginning.